New York City now has checkpoints at its bridges, tunnels, train stations, and airports. Travelers from 34 states and Puerto Rico will have to fill out a health form for contact tracing. Anyone caught violating the order could get hit with a $10,000 fine. The city says it wants to make sure out-of-towners actually follow the 14-day quarantine order. NBC News correspondent Ron Allen outside one of those checkpoints at New York City's Penn Station. Ron, what will people have to go through there at Penn Station starting today?
Well, these are called checkpoints, but they're more like a check-in. It's a very non-confrontational system whereby New Yorkers are trying to keep the numbers down. So anyone arriving, for example, on a train here from Florida or from the Washington, D.C. area, because it's Virginia and Maryland that are on the hot zone list, they're greeted by someone from the city's testing and tracing area who give them a form to fill out and that will tell them where they're going to be during this time, and information about the need, the requirement. It's a mandate, it's a requirement to self-quarantine for 14 days upon arriving in New York. Now, this is a mandate that's been on the books since June 25th, but now they're really trying to get even more serious about it, to try and enforce it. There are also representatives, officers from the city sheriff's department who are stationed at bridges, tunnels, coming into the city. They are stopping cars randomly, they say. Every sixth or seventh car, they stopped several dozen of them during a 3-hour period last night. We're just finding out what they describe as a pilot program that's going to increase again, giving people information, telling them about this quarantine requirement, and telling them about how they can get help along the way if they're quarantining. For example, a hotel room, food deliveries, other services that are available. The bottom line is that New York's numbers are rock bottom low. The infection rate is like around 1% or less. They want to keep it that way. And studies have shown, their research has shown that as much as 20% of the new cases happening here in recent weeks are being brought here by people from out of state. That's why they're stepping up this mechanism now, because they see what's happening all around this city and this state. The numbers are spiking, the numbers are going up, and they don't want to see a second wave happen here. Allison?
Ron, so I have to ask, how is the city enforcing this order? Will they actually be following up with people to make sure that they're quarantining, to hit them potentially with a $10,000 fine?
Well, they have been making phone calls, text messaging people who have filled out these forms, and that's been happening over the recent months. They say there are as many as 100,000 contacts that they have made. This, of course, is also part of the contact tracing program to try and pinpoint where the outbreaks of the virus are happening. It's very unclear yet what exactly you have to do or not do to get a $10,000 fine. That's very unclear. There are obviously smaller penalties that can be imposed. We don't have a clear understanding yet of what exactly constitutes what. And I guess that will develop as we go along the way. The bottom line is that they're hoping for compliance, and they're emphasizing that this is a non-confrontational thing they're doing. This is being run by the sheriff's office. It's being run by the city's testing and tracing department. It's not being run by NYPD or by state troopers who are acting like police officers, law enforcement, trying to enforce this public health mandate. There's been some concern expressed by the New York Civil Liberties Union, wondering, okay, so what's going to happen to all this information that you get about people? There have been some people that we've heard from in the community who have saying that they just don't want this intrusion. They don't want another level of law enforcement or something like that stopping them and asking them questions. There are tens of thousands of people who come to this city and the state from out of state. They're not going to find everyone. They're just hoping to send the message that it's a requirement to quarantine for 14 days because they're trying to stop the spread. Allison?
All right, Ron, a lot of New Yorkers hoping that message gets across. Ron Allen outside Penn Station, thank you so much.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.